if you're Daryl and you know that the Clippers are the practically the only team that could be a realistic trade partner, do you bite the bullet and just take 50 cents on the dollar, or do you just try and stick it out knowing that you have a guy in Joel Embiid? Because that's another part of the equation. Because Joel's not going to he's not the happiest camper if James Joel is not pleased with this whole situation, frankly
Right.
speaking.
No, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I hit on that before vacation, and honestly learned a bit. This is one of my favorite
Right.
parts of the job is when you report on something and you feel like you hit it close to the mark, but then on the back
Right.
end, once people see that you put certain things out there a certain way, then they'll kind of educate you even more. That did happen on the Joel Embiid story. So he says publicly, I forget where he was. He was in a was it
Some
a
kind of conference.
he was in a conference, and he alludes to the idea that that he wants to win a championship, whether it's in Philly or somewhere else.
Right.
You talked earlier about James being calculated. These players are smart and they
Yeah.
know how to handle their voice. And the idea was that all right, Joel had made a choice to put that thought out into the ecosystem about the idea that maybe he wouldn't be in Philly. So the Sixers stance and their response at that time was, listen, Joel has talked for years about wanting to stay here for his whole career, to want to go the way of Kobe and Steph Curry and guys like that, Giannis to this point, and be with one franchise, Dirk. Now, that's all well and good, and that's all very true. That has been Joel's mindset. But it was, the part that I did learn about was like, no, it's the last couple of years, there's also been a pretty clear message that, like, if you guys keep effing around, for lack of a better way of putting it, and don't give me the right kind of group, that makes me feel like a title contender, then who knows what happens? Maybe he does ask out. That pressure is there. The Sixers know
Right.
it's there, and Joel this summer had, it seemed, tried to. I mean, he and James are fine, but he had tried to connect with James at some offseason events and essentially convince him to stay, convince him to be good. I think you're hitting on something really important, which is, man, once Joel Embiid saw what James Harden had to say in China, what was his reaction? Because I don't know exactly who Joel, if he's got a list of players that he would love to play with, or if he's
Right.
looking at Daryl just saying, give me whatever the Clippers are willing to give you, and let me work, let me cook. But yeah, the Joel factor is huge here.
And to add to that Joel thing, I've heard, obviously the New York angle is there as well, but
Yep, 100%.
another team is Houston as well. Like just because of the bond between Joel and Ime, and just that situation where they've added older
This is
veteran
where
players.
super producer Andrew Schleck should splice in some is an oldie but goodie. Alanis Morissette's "Isn't That Ironic?" We need some ironic music right now.
So
Thank you,
so
Schleck.
so I think maybe in the next year or so, I think, because obviously if Joel stays this season and plays it out, that's one thing. But moving forward from that, I do think New York and Houston are the two teams to watch if it ever came to a situation where Joel said, I want to leave too. Because look, this whole union of James and Joel, it hasn't been perfect, right? So you go back to how James got there in the first place and having to essentially pigeonhole his game to just give Joel the ball. That was Philly's game plan for a lot of nights, right? Because he was such a dominant big man and everything was going his way, winning the MVP. The whole stuff with him and Doc. I remember a story you put out going back to the video with James and Doc speaking, before the season, and how important that was, because that the way that Doc has been able to kind of role play us the wrong way at times, and
Right.
that whole interesting dynamic with that.
If
So
anybody doesn't remember that, it still blows me away, Kelly, that
yeah,
happened. And
I know.
I've tried since then to get clarity on the question of whether or not James knew he was being recorded. So
Right.
NBA TV comes into Sixers camp and had this all access video of Doc talking to James, and really, and I'm paraphrasing, just telling him like, listen, for us to be at our best, we got to feed the big fella. And then James pushed back a little bit, not in any kind of acrimonious way, but pushed back and said, I just know that, like, if you let me cook, then I'm going to bring the defense, and it's going to make life easier for him. So they were
Right.
having, it was the kind of dialogue that it was so interesting to watch, because it happens on every team, but we just typically don't get to see it. But to your point, my first thought was like, oh boy, like, Doc is pretty calculated in his own right with his voice and his profile in the media. And so
Right.
that might have helped the optics for Doc because it really looked like he was leading their group. But did James know that he was being recorded? Now, the answer I've gotten was most likely yes. Like James is a bright dude, knows that it was, an all access practice. But you go from that to this, and I think what you're highlighting is the fact that literally for years, it's a Kobe Shaq light type of dynamic
Right.
that they have been
Exactly.
trying to navigate, and it's obviously reached this point.